Okay, now we're live on YouTube. So now I'm going to bring it. Are you guys ready?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Colin Musful. I am the founder and editor of History Through Fiction, and this is a virtual celebration of the Porcelain Menagerie by Jillian Forsberg with the audiobook narrator Caroline Hewitt. You guys do have the availability to turn your cameras on or off, your mics on or off. If you would just mute yourselves throughout the program. In a little bit, I'm going to invite questions from the audience. And if you want to speak up at that time, you're welcome to. Or you can also just post those questions in the chat and I can moderate them from there. We also got a few questions prior to the event, so I'm going to make sure I read those off to our special guests, Jillian and Caroline. But welcome. We're so glad that you could be here to celebrate Jillian's second novel. Her first novel, The Rhino Keeper, was really well received. I'm sure many of you have read it. It won several awards, including being named a 2025 Kansas Notable Book. Congratulations, Jillian.
Thank you.
And Caroline Hewitt was the narrator for that novel, and she's also the narrator of The Porcelain Menagerie, which is a companion novel to The Rhino Keeper because one of the characters in The Rhino Keeper is also in The Porcelain Menagerie. So, without any further introduction, I'm just going to start asking some questions of Jillian and Caroline. And Caroline, in a little bit, is going to do a live reading for us from the novel, so that'll be fun. So, Jillian, once again, congratulations. The book comes out October 21st. You've got a lot planned. Why don't you just start by telling us what you have going on for the release of your second novel?
I have so many events. I'm really excited about it. I think I'm going to, oh my gosh, I think it's 15 book tour stops. So if anyone online is going to be anywhere in Oklahoma or the Kansas area, I'll probably see you at your library or local bookstore. But this time around it's a little more serious. Both book-wise and tour-wise. I think the main reason for that is because so many people were enchanted by The Rhino Keeper, and it has been received so well that the librarians and bookstore people around the state of Kansas are like, "Hi, what do you have to show us?" And I'm really excited to be able to show them the Porcelain Menagerie. It's not as cozy as the Rhino Keeper, but it's interesting to say that because I feel like there were moments in the Rhino Keeper where there was a great amount of danger and risk and drama going on. But I think people still fell in love with the character of Clara herself. And the Porcelain Menagerie has some of those lighthearted moments as well, but it is a darker, deeper, more serious book. And I like that about it. It was much more challenging to write, and I can't wait to be able to really speak with readers. But I haven't had a book club about the Porcelain Menagerie yet, so I've been trying to like keep things like to myself as far as the big spoilers go. But I'm excited to be able to share those moments finally with everyone when the book is out.
Yeah, it comes out October 21st, so I'm sure many people have pre-ordered it. If they want copies right now, and some people have bought it through this event, you can get them at historythroughfiction.com and we'll ship those right away, or Jillian will actually sign and ship those for you. I forgot to ask people, please say hello in the chat. Just let us know where you're joining us from, what you're looking forward to this fall, anything at all, just to say hello. Caroline, why don't you say hello? Tell us a little bit about yourself and your experience getting to narrate the Rhino Keeper and the Porcelain Menagerie.
Hi, yeah, I'm Caroline Hewitt. I'm in Brooklyn, New York, and I'm an audiobook narrator. And I was saying to Jillian at before you all came into this meeting, what a beautiful book I feel like. Well, both of them are so beautiful. And the Porcelain Menagerie, I felt especially, I really was moved to tears narrating this, especially with, the tie-in the Rhino Keeper, the character that you know, and you sort of have a sense of maybe what might happen to the characters. And it was very fun for me. I really love doing accents, and there are a lot of accents in this book, and it was also a challenge in that way. But mostly, it was, such an encompassing and intense world that I really loved escaping into it, even in the moments that were a little uncomfortable. I found it super captivating and transporting.
So I don't want to take the spotlight off Jillian, but I have to ask you, Carolyn, the King Augustus. Obviously, you got your idea of who he was based on Jillian's writing of him. Jillian notes that he's a man child. I just could not get enough of him in your narration. How did you come up with that, and how fun was that?
It was so fun. And I have a little bit of the King Augustus to do in the narration today that I'm excited about. Um, I feel like there was a freedom to narrating him because of his power. And like to jump into the skin of a man who can do anything he wants and have anyone respond to him, it doesn't actually matter how he says what he's going to say. He can say it however he wants because it's going to be listened to, it's going to be responded to. And so his power, as so beautifully written by Jillian, is in his impetuosity and his keeping people on their toes, right? Because he can be as much of a child as he wants, but he's ultimately the ruler of a huge amount of land, right? And so it was really fun to play with that and to play with him amusing himself with the way that he said things and delighting himself, which I was then delighted by because I don't know, there's
Why?
just a freedom. It was sort of like this is going to sound odd, but when I was my background is acting for theater, and if I ever had a character who was drunk on stage, I loved it because I always felt like there was a sort of unhooking from structure, like almost I would think of like the sort of structured way that we are all in our lives was unhooked when the character would drink maybe, and I felt that way with Augustus in terms of he can be as relaxed as he wants because he knows his power, and it was delicious and actually slightly intoxicating to play that. I was like, this would be goodness, it would be fun to be king of, Poland and Germany and all these places at that time and have all that power.
I could totally tell that when I listen to it. And one of the things I don't think a lot of readers know is that Carolyn and I share character notes. And I don't know if all of your authors do that for you, but I love doing that. I make these little paragraphs and I cast the movie. So I'm like, okay, here's the actor I see in my head for this. Is you have like a visual of what he looked like. And if there's actually portraits of the historical figure, which there are of Augustus, I send them over so she can see what they look like. And then I'm like, he's a mixture of this, and that, and he likes this, and maybe his favorite color is purple. But it's like this whole tiny little snippet of what the character is like, so that when she jumps in, she knows exactly who they're supposed to be before she gets to the grand reveal that happens in reading. And I think one of the best things that I listen to, yeah, there he is. Look at him. He's so beautiful, right? One of the best things for me about that was you made me laugh out loud with someone who was pretty despicable. And I was laughing because the grandiose voice and everything that you used, I was like, oh my gosh, this is exactly how he would have been. Can we go back to like 1710 and listen to him? No. But guaranteed, after all the work that I have done and research I've done on learning what that man was probably like, I think you nailed it. And the way that the characters reacted to him they were kind of all like, oh, I didn't expect this king to be so much like a boy, a silly, strange teenage boy who has no idea what the real world is like, is really the vibe I got from him. But there's this undertone that you put in too of what does power do to a person who has no control over themselves when they're
Mm.
trying to control everyone else, and you can hear that. He doesn't have any filter. There's nothing that is beyond him to do, and he feels that everyone should listen to him no matter what. And when you have a few characters like you did narrate that were trying to challenge him, the pauses, the breaths, the fear in their tone was so well done. And I listened to that in my head all the time. But to hear you actually act it out was absolutely brilliant.
Thank you. And I will say that I love getting the character notes from you. It's so fun. But every time I look at the character, I think, oh, yes, that's exactly what I was thinking too, because Jillian wrote it so well.
Oh, thank you
So
so
there's
much.
never any surprises in your notes, because it's all in the structure of what you've created already.
That's wonderful to hear. I hope all of my readers feel that way.
Caroline, for at least a week after I first listened to it, I was saying a goose tooth in my head over and over
Augustus.
again. Yeah,
Yes.
Augustus.
it's pretty
Will you
funny.
talk about that? Because I'm in Kansas, and you and I talked a lot when we did the Rhino Keeper too, of how to say Douwe Mount Vandermeer.
Mm.
And these are 18th century pronunciations of names that me as a Midwestern Kansas girl may not fully understand. So talk to us about all of the background that you have with, I know that you speak German and French, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's such a debate, right? Because I always love to lean into like, this is the full German pronunciation. Yes. And then I'm like, but then is it like do German, do German? You know what I mean? I'm like, this is maybe a little extreme. But I feel like this book especially supported it because it really is, it really should be, you know, deeply set there. That's a huge plot point actually. And yeah, no, I love linguistics and I love languages, and there's some great resources online where I can get the actual pronunciation or as close as I can. And I really enjoy like making sure that I get that specifically right. But then of course you bring up the good point, right? Like in terms of historical pronunciation, it's always going to be through the filter of now, because your readers are reading it now, just in the same way that you're not writing your dialogue like the exact, you know, wording that and speech patterns they would do then, because it wouldn't be emotionally resonant, right? We would all be taking out our little glossaries and trying to figure out what was being said instead of responding to the story. So I feel the same way. You know, sometimes I have books that are set in time periods with historical characters that we can listen to.
Mm.
And I sort of do like, I listen to them and I do a flavor of my interpretation of that character, because again, it's through the filter of the novel and then through me. I had one where I had to do JFK. It was so
Oh
stressful.
no.
It was so stressful. It was a wonderful book about Jacqueline Kennedy, and at the end JFK was there, and I got really stressed because I was like, we all know what he sounds like, right?
Yeah, I can hear it.
Yes, yes. But then I thought, okay, but it's through the author's filter. It's through like it's a first person narrative, so it's through Jackie's filter later in her life, and then it's through the filter of me, because we're all conduits for the story, right? We're not pretending that our perspectives aren't overlaid, right? So I sort of thought like it's gonna be like a hint of JFK, you know. But it's especially fun with a book like this where you know, nobody knows exactly what they sounded like, so we
Yeah.
can just go for it.
There's a little pressure there too, and I think that's a good point because I had two characters in this book. Well, the majority of characters in this book are very small people in history. Johann Candler, there's one or two portraits that exist of him, and that really resonated with me when I found out about that because the man left behind hundreds of pieces of porcelain art, and yet we don't even know what color his eyes were. That really kind of struck me when I was researching the Rhino Keeper to figure out, okay, now they're in the porcelain factory, and what was that porcelain maker like? And I look it up, and all we have is this black cutout silhouette of him. Right. For me, that was one of the reasons that I felt compelled to write this book. And then when I'm delving deeper into the story of what the Dresden court was like, I came across in Augustus's will the story of Fatima, the handmaiden who turned into his mistress. In his will, he left behind 8,000, is it Thaler?
Allah, yeah.
There you go, that's it. Money. And he did not leave behind any of his other mistresses any money. He had dozens of mistresses that we know about, and I can't imagine how many kitchen maids' lives he's ruined. But why leave money to Fatima, a person who was stolen as a child as a war prize, handed from person to person as if she was an object, had two of his children. Her son with Augustus is not even talked about in the book because it would have made things even more complicated. And yet he left her money. I couldn't stop thinking about her. Once again, there's one portrait. And I said, she's never going to stop knocking at the door of my mind unless I write her story. Never. So I had to. And there's a lot of assumptions about her, but I tell you what, there's not assumptions about what her life was really like. And it's complicated because part of it was safe and part of it was unsafe. And I think as women, we all know that feeling where you're going to wake up in a warm bed, but is this the warm bed that you want to be in? Um, and writing her part, especially with the control that she exerted over her menagerie and trying to find safety for her own child, boy, that resonates hundreds of years later with me. And, you know, I think when you're talking about people who don't have a lot of primary sources around them, making them come to life for me is even more important than someone like JFK, who we know what color his eyes were and what the cadence of his voice sounded like, but these people are lost. And so by bringing them back just a little bit, even in the shadow of a king who was not a very nice person, I think it's been really important to me to feel like I'm part of their legacy.
Jillian, excuse me, Jillian, can you expand on that a little bit with the animals? Because you're talking a lot about people, but part of your niche here is with the animal fiction and bringing like the lion in the Porcelain Menagerie or Clara in the Rhino Keeper. How do you give them voice, and what's the importance of that?
Well, I've always said that animals in history have no voice because they don't speak. And if you think about the pattern of why humans expanded and did everything that we did, from horses to oxen to house pets, animals are a huge part of the history of the world. And oftentimes they have absolutely no record in the history books besides war horses or, the elephants crossing the Himalayas in a war. But I found a few notes about the menagerie that was in Augustus's court. And one of them was from a British man who was visiting the menagerie, and he made a comment about how lovely the lions were, excepting that the older male only had one eye. And that stuck in my brain and would not allow me to let it go because there's no record of how that lion lost its eye. And the fact that it was considered lovely, even though it was severely damaged, also really stuck with me because that's another allegory behind the whole story. Then I realized while I was researching all of this that without the living menagerie, the porcelain menagerie never would have existed. And even though those animals are gone and have been for hundreds of years, the porcelain menagerie still exists. And I actually have one with me today. I have a turtle. So this is Botger's Redware, which was the first attempt at Meissen porcelain to make actual porcelain. You can see the crossed swords on the bottom there. So all pre-orders are entered to win this Meissen porcelain turtle. Can you believe that? And this was what they first thought was porcelain until they got to this, right? So they, from life, looked at all of these animals and spent hours studying them and figuring out every little nuance and detail. And if you think about realism in art, they did a really fine job making some of the animals, and some of the animals they had never seen before. And so they did a pretty terrible job of making those animals. But to be able to take something living and turn it into something everlasting was another big thing for me to talk about. I think that there is such history and emotion in art, and all of the pieces of art in the Rhino Keeper and in the Porcelain Menagerie are real. I did not make any of those up. You can find them in museums around the world or in archives. If you need to look at all the drawings and paintings and everything that exists, they still do. And when I got to see the Porcelain Menagerie for the first time, well, first of all, I was covered in goosebumps because that's just how it goes. But the first thing that I saw when I turned the corner was a rhino. And it was the wrong rhino. It was Durer's rhino. And then later on in the exhibit, I saw a tiny Clara, and I'm sure all of the German museum guards were like, what is wrong with this American lady? But that real art, those real people and the real animals, they never leave the way that I approach writing and history. You can't write historical fiction without writing about how people used to be so reliant on animals and how fascinating it was when exotic animals came into the picture, especially in the menageries in the 18th century. And I talk about this all the time when I do book clubs. It opened up people's worlds so that they understood that their own neighborhood was not the end all be all. And that helped everyone understand that we are all responsible for a larger sense of self than we would be if we had never seen something exotic or something that changed our perspectives.
There's a great scene in the novel where the porcelain makers are like discussing what do these animals look like, and we kind of don't think about that because we can just Google search an animal. We see them everywhere all the time. They wouldn't have any idea what a penguin or something that is not native to their homeland, what it might look like.
Yeah, they probably wouldn't have even known that penguins were a thing. Like it's weird because our brains now are so overloaded with information. But if you're living in 1710s Dresden, Saxony, Germany, you are seeing horses, oxen, dogs, cats, foxes, badgers, wolves, that kind of stuff. You're not going to see a lion or a rhino or a jaguar or a monkey unless you went to the menagerie or unless a foreigner brought those things into the marketplace. And that really would have been like seeing a unicorn today. It would have been absolutely remarkable. And that story is resonating through the Rhino Keeper, but also in the Porcelain Menagerie when these porcelain makers who have lived in a small place their entire lives are like, okay, So the king asked for 600 animals, and we have 20 that we know that they look like. So are they going to be disappointed when they show them a
And
griffin?
that they also are like, and then we're gonna make a griffin and all these things that they're like, no, that's totally a real animal, because how would they know that a unicorn or whatever and it is not real if an elephant is,
Right, exactly. And we've all seen those medieval drawings of animals that are hilarious. Some of the porcelain menagerie that still exists, you're looking at like, huh, what's that supposed to be?
Yeah, talk about a filter, right? Yeah.
Yes, truly, a filter. And when the king was presented it, I'm sure he was like, what a magnificent fill in the blank. And they were like, yes, that's exactly what that's supposed to be. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But it's amazing to see their interpretation of what those animals would have looked like in 3D, because we often don't see that. We might see bronze sculptures, but not for a long time after. In marble sculptures, we see, but porcelain animals did not exist anywhere else. This was truly a unique thing. And even today, the Meissen people who made these happen in the 18th century are considered some of the finest porcelain artists who have ever existed. And that's saying a lot considering that the Chinese porcelain artists really not only had monopoly on it, but made truly the finest works of art in the world.
So you mentioned that you got to go and see some of these, and I want to ask you more about that later. Before we do, I want to bring Carolyn back in. And Carolyn, I'm sorry, I can't. My mind can't decide if it's Carolyn or Caroline. Do you have a?
Carolyn, but it's spelled Caroline.
Okay.
That makes sense that your mind can't decide.
If you are going to do a live reading for us, if you could go ahead and do that when you're ready.
Absolutely. This is from chapter 13, and I won't give context, but I also don't think there's any spoilers in this. So Johann rushed up the servants' stairs near the kitchen, his heavy body stomping. Near the stony hallway to the unused dining room, he heard the booming, low voice of Augustus and a response from a lighter one. It sounded female. Johann ran down the hall, nearly colliding with clay-dusted workers at the end of their day, and stopped firmly in front of the modeler's room. He pulled his tunic, wiped his brow, and descended the spiral staircase. Augustus, Maria, Katharina, and Samuel stood peering down the blackened staircase that led to the kilns. Samuel turned, and in seeing Johann, excused himself. "I'm so sorry," said Johann. "Tell that to Hal. He's searching the castle for you, boy." "I will. I was sketching in the menagerie. Katharina was there too. Don't tell anyone that. Play like you've been working upstairs this whole time. Make it sound like something special just for Augustus." "It's all special just for Augustus, Samuel." Samuel nudged his shoulder, then wrapped his hands around the backs of Samuel nudged his shoulder, then wrapped his hands around the back of Johann's arms and pushed him to Augustus and the women. "Your Majesty," Johann said, bowing low. "Ah, my god of creation!" Augustus took heavy steps away from the black, burned walls of the stairwell. "I apologize for my tardiness. Perhaps you'd like to see what I've been working on? I would love to show you the most secret of rooms here." "Surely that's the kilns, where we cannot go," Augustus said, his eyes gleaming. "No, Your Highness. It's the place where I mold your animals, where the water troughs on elevated tables sit for the makers, where tools and hands make kaolin into art, where—" Augustus was suddenly by his side and pressed his wide, salty hand over Johann's mouth. "The secrets should remain secrets. Show me this room, but speak no more." Johann's breath grew moist and hot under the king's hand. Augustus pressed hard, pulling his hand away, sending Johann reeling backward. The king smiled, showing no teeth, and Maria approached, eyes wide. Katharina stayed behind several steps, hands clenched into fists. Johann steadied himself. He clenched his teeth, boiling with threatening anger. Hal broke the silence. "Up the stairs, then, to the modeler's workshop," he said, waving a thin arm in the right direction. Johann followed last, wanting to lick his lips, but feared tasting the king's hand. He wiped his mouth with his sleeve. He wanted to feel anger, to strike out, to scream and stomp his foot. But his father's voice from the pulpit came to him. He that is slow to anger is better than the mighty. Hellman's voice emerged, a ghost's dialogue. Proverbs, chapter 16, verse 32. Keep me calm, he thought, and proceeded to follow Katarina's trembling form up the spiral staircase tower. Samuel waited ahead. Johann, you must watch yourself, he said, whispering with fear in his eyes. I was trying to help distract him from the fact that I was late. Revealing secrets of the arcanum will get you chained to the floor, or worse. Johann felt his breath, hot in his nose. He sighed, forcing his anger out, uncurling his fists. Make your wares, deliver them, improve the manufactory, make your money, keep your mouth shut.
Yay, that was so amazing. Thank you so much.
Thanks. For fun.
I mean, I have so many questions just having seen you at your craft. Can you just give us an idea of how you perfect your craft and how you do that? Because obviously you can't just take a book and start reading it, and you have so many other books that you're narrating. How do you keep track of all the voices and how do you prepare yourself for each page that you're going to read? What's the prep work you do in order to make that come alive like that?
Yeah, so I read the whole thing through and I highlight the different characters' lines so that, like, I think Augustus was red, so that whenever I saw, okay, red is coming up, some part of me is sort of getting ready for Augustus, and Johann, I think, was bright green. And then I circle any words that I might not know how to pronounce, which surprisingly, there's a lot, like bougainvillea, that flower. That wasn't in this book, but it's in so many books, and I always forget how to pronounce that. So there's a lot of words you think, oh yeah, I know how to pronounce this, and then you get to it and you're like, wait a minute. Or you get sent corrections later and realize, okay, it's bougainvillea or whatever. I think it's actually not. So you go through all of that, and then I write down all the characters and any descriptions about the characters from the book. And I sort of let them marinate in my mind for a while. And then I come back to the book a little bit before recording, and I go through and I record a little clip of myself doing the character's voice for a couple lines. But then I'll also say, like, Augustus is sort of wild in the way he does his voice, and the pitch variation is a lot, and it's all over my mouth, you know? So I give myself an actual, like, physical description of how it feels to make the voice.
Wow.
So that it's not just seeing the character in my mind or, relying on the lines that are there, but sort of a physical sensation to differentiate them, which then makes switching between them easier. Like the character of How, I think, like, is very, like, low and super grounded. And so I can think of that physically as opposed to Augustus being all over there.
I saw your mouth change when I was watching you. You're right, Augustus was everywhere. And then when you got to How, your entire cadence slowed and lowered. It was incredible.
Oh,
It was
thanks.
so cool.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
it's nice to have that physical aspect, especially because narrating, I'm just sitting there in my booth, right? And I think of it a lot like when I was doing theater for many, many years, table work was always the beginning of a rehearsal process. And I liked the table work best. Once I was like, I am standing up, I have a body. What do I do with a body? So this is sort of like doing table work all the time, which is really fun. But I also don't want to ignore the, like, apparatus, because otherwise everything gets very stiff and doesn't sound very good. So I record along. I sort of set myself a page goal every day, and I can always go back because it's just me. There's not a director. I'm directing myself. And we use something called punch and roll, which just means that if I make a mistake, the computer program I'm using will feed me back in, so I can send along to the post-production just clean audio without any mistakes in it. Occasionally I'll go back if I feel like, okay, this voice is not really working. I'll go back and re-record the character occasionally, or especially, like, if I haven't noticed that I have, two characters have a really intense dialogue and their voices are kind of similar. We actually had that, I think, with the Rhino Keeper, right?
Yep.
You were listening to a chapter and you thought that two of the voices sounded really similar to you. And so I went back and switched them, just pulled them each a little bit further away, because that helps the listener, right? So it's
Right.
like, I need to do what works for the author and what works for my interpretation of the characters. But ultimately, the most important thing is clarity.
Right.
Whether it's of each word or of the characters or of the picture being painted. So yeah, so I record it all and then send it along to post-production and get notes from the author, and that's kind of how it works. And I love it. It's great. It's like I think it's the closest to living inside a book that I can imagine. Well, not probably writing is closer, but yeah, other than writing. Yeah.
We had to do that with the Rhino Keeper regarding names too, to make sure there was a distinction in names, so subtle little changes. And for those that don't know, you'll send us a 15-minute snippet before you go forward with the whole audiobook, just in case there are some things that I or the author says, well, can you change this or change that? So you don't have to go back and re-record huge portions of it.
Yeah, exactly right.
I also want to point out there are some people in our audience that will be at the conference, and Carolyn is doing a live reading at the conference where you can submit a page from your manuscript, and she's just going to act it out right there on the spot. So that'll be
That's
really
so
fun.
cool.
I think it's going to be really fun. I think I'll have to be very clear that that's not how the narration, like if I'm actually narrating a book, I prepare. There's no scenario in which I'm like, let's record this. Do you know? But for the sake of a live performance, any kind of improv is just so much more fun. Plus, it's really fun for me to take what's on the page and the way that things are written and just like run with it and really soak it up quickly, because with good writing, it's just such a pleasure to just jump right into who those people are and have it be so accurate.
Well, I want to get to some questions from the audience. I've got a couple that were pre-submitted. We are getting some in the chat. So if you have a question, go ahead and post it to the chat, and I'll get to those when I can. Before I do, Jillian, I had mentioned, and you had also brought up that you got to go to Dresden. You got to go to Albrechtsberg. I can't say it like Carolyn. Uh, how much fun was that? Why were you getting the side eye from the museum guards? Like, tell us about it.
Well, I think part of it is just my energy is a lot. So when I was around very literally priceless porcelain works, and I'm sitting there with my copy of my book, like, take my picture, and I'm getting really, really close. And there weren't buzzers at that. Well, no, there were buzzers at that museum, but if you get too close to artifacts at big museums, they buzz you. But I know I like just got as close as I could. I'm like, I'm not gonna touch it, I promise. But I wanted to see it because if you zoom in on the photos of all the porcelain menagerie pieces, there are huge cracks and fissures and holes, and the glaze is crackled, and the bottom's all drippy, and you can see humanity in this art. It's not perfect. And I think that's one of the reasons I love it. So I went to Dresden and I got to see Augustus's throne room and his bed and his clothing and his saddle and his jewels, and Carolyn's eyes are getting so big. And I went through this place called the Green Vault where all of his treasure is still stored today. Absolutely insane to be able to see those items that still exist. In 2019, it was robbed, and so it is. I've been to a lot of museums around the world. That is the highest security museum I've ever been to. It is one of the largest treasure collections in the world. So if you have a chance to see any photos of the Green Vault in Dresden, do it. But the highlight of the trip for me was twofold. One, Meissen porcelain is still made today in Meissen, Germany. It's been around since 1710, and I got a behind the scenes tour of the factory by the factory workers. I got to dip my hands in the kaolin clay, and there was still kaolin under my fingernails for several days, no matter how much I scrubbed. And I got to smell it and see the production, and I got to watch porcelain makers paint their wares. And then I got to go to Albrechtsberg. Now, it's not really practical to have a porcelain factory in a castle anymore, but Albrechtsberg is the oldest castle in Germany, and it really wasn't used for very much. It's basically this beautiful castle on a hill. And Augustus decided that since it wasn't used a lot, they were going to turn it into a porcelain manufactory where the kilns were in the basement, as Carolyn described. I got to poke my head down into the stairwell that, if you have read the book, there is a very significant thing that happens with the basement of Albrechtsberg. And to be able to physically be there was overwhelming. But the very best part of that entire trip was something that I did not plan or expect. We stayed at an incredible little Airbnb. It was a 14th century apartment building, and we stayed at the very top level. And I knew that somewhere in Saxony, Johann Candler's grave existed, but I didn't know where. And I thought, well, we're here, I might as well look it up and see if it's within driving distance or if we could take the train and go. And I Googled it, and find a grave is still very helpful overseas. And I could just press the go, and we had walking instructions. And surprisingly, it was in Meissen where we were staying. And my daughter and husband and I were going back up to our Airbnb, and we're like, this isn't, this is, Cody's like, Jillian, are you sure this is the path to the grave? Because this is exactly the path to the Airbnb. And I said, okay, I don't know. We'll just follow the path and see. The path leads us to a churchyard, and we go in, and of course, Meissen is a fairy tale town. The sky is blue, the birds are singing, the church bells start ringing, and I find the grave of Johann Candler, which was directly underneath the window of where we had been staying the entire week, and I had no knowledge that that's where his grave actually was. Um, it is a beautiful Baroque grave. It is sandstone. It is fading with the hundreds of years that it has been there. It basically says this, here lies Johann Joachim Candler, the king's favorite sculptor. Um, my
Was
daughter, yes.
Sorry, had you already written the book at this point, or were you
Yes, I had
Oh,
already written the book. And so I took the book the next day to the gravesite and said, Cody and Phoebe, please just stay. Let me have a moment with Johann. And I read him a section of the book where he is with his younger brother. Um, and I left flowers at his grave, and I know I'm so um that really felt like a homecoming in a way where I said, hey, people are still talking about you, and your art is still alive. Yeah, so that was wonderful. I have not made that post on social media yet because I'm gonna cry when I do, but I'm planning just a couple days before launch day of showing photos of his grave, which is the most elaborate thing I've ever seen in my life. So
You have some grave digging in both your
I
novels.
do. I don't know how that happened. Actually, one of my beta readers said, Jillian, this is a lot like the Rhino Keeper. I said, that's fine. You like a thing, you stick with it, you know?
Well, I've got a question submitted prior to the event that asks, there are connections between the Rhino Keeper and the Porcelain Menagerie. How did you decide to write the Rhino Keeper first and Porcelain Menagerie second? Was there ever any thought to write one book, or did it become like, when did you decide you had two books out of this?
The Rhino Keeper occurred to me. I had a bolt of lightning strike me when I saw an Indian rhino for the first time at a zoo in Kansas. And I Googled Indian rhinos, learned there were around that point 3,500 of them left on the planet. Now there's 4,000. Woohoo. And I wanted to read a novel about Clara, and there wasn't one. So I decided that I should probably write it myself. I wrote that book it took me about a year to research, about 6 months to write it. And in 2023, when I was seeking publication for The Rhino Keeper, I started writing another book because I had no idea that the Porcelain Menagerie story existed and would not have without Clara, because Clara was made into porcelain by Johann Candler. So I had to write The Rhino Keeper first, or I never would have discovered Johann and Fatima or King Augustus. I would have had no idea that they even existed without Clara. And I feel like a lot of writers do that. They find a little rabbit hole they go down when they're researching one book, and then they find their idea for the next. But it was really risky of me to start writing a companion to this while The Rhino Keeper had no future promised. And then during our very first meeting, Colin, I remember saying to you, hey, I have another book. And you're like, let's see how the first one goes first. And I safe to say it's gone really well. So yeah, I don't think that I could have ever been satisfied if I would not have written the Porcelain Menagerie, because, like I said, those obscure figures from the past kept knocking at my door, and the door of my mind is not something that I can ever ignore. So I was really happy to be able to write both of those books.
And you have a list of about 15 or 20 more. Are they all going to keep knocking on your door?
Yeah, it's kind of loud in there sometimes. Yeah, I literally have a note on my phone that has all of these random book ideas in it. So I need to like rank them, be like, Jillian, you only have so many years of life. What are you can't write 40 books. Maybe I could. I could write 40 books. Let's go.
Carolyn, someone in the audience asks about keeping your voice in top condition, and you said you're just getting over a cold, which made it a little difficult for you. So, what strategies do you have to be able to use your voice professionally like that?
yeah, so I went to drama school. So I learned all the good vocal techniques, which I choose sometimes to ignore. But usually I do a vocal warm up before I record, which is great. And then I limit the amount of time I record. I don't, I wouldn't record for more than 6 hours a day. That would be a lot because it's different from speaking to someone else. There's no pauses when I'm recording. I can just talk and talk and talk, you know. I mean, there's pauses obviously in the text, but it's all me. So I do that, and then I also do a vocal sort of cool down. And then there's also certain character voices that I know are more taxing on my voice. And so I steer choices of character voices away from, like, if there's a very, very gruff, low-pitched man, I wouldn't make him a main character because that I can't sustain that for that long.
Mm.
And frankly, I probably wouldn't be given a book where there's a very, very gruff, low-pitched man as a main character because those tend to go to male narrators. But yeah, so it's making smart vocal choices and then also vocal warm-ups. And then yeah, I mean, I had a bad cold the last couple weeks and I did record a book, and there's this weird thing where it's like I didn't sound like me, but I did sound like a person who has an okay voice. And so I'm like, okay, well, my voice was compromised for that whole book. And that the people who listen to that are just going to hear a slightly different voice from the people who listen to other books.
As
I
long
still
as it's
sounded, I still
consistent,
sounded
right?
fine in that world. It just was not, it just, if you can't have you can't have your voice change during a book, but if it's all the same, it's fine.
Mhm.
I won't tell you what book that was in case anyone wants to listen. You can all find it for yourself.
Are you able to use your skill outside of narrating books, like in everyday life? Do you find yourself able to use that in any way?
I do, like, I feel that I'm a good bedtime story reader to my little daughter.
Mhm.
And it's actually very cute. She's very little. She's only 9 months. And I'll debut voices and be like, test them out. And I know that the voice is good if she turns around to check that it's still me. It's very cute. So I'm like, okay, that's a keeper because it doesn't sound like me. She thought it was someone else.
Jillian, we got another question before the event. This is from Greg Sanford. Thank you, Greg. He comes to all of our events. He's very supportive. He says the narrative draws a parallel between craftsmen creating a porcelain menagerie and a woman creating a living menagerie, both within an autocratic environment, and both projects fail. So he's asking, does that environment suggest that art can't succeed under those kinds of pressures?
Um, I think that's a really interesting question. So I think that if you, it's not necessarily that they, okay, okay, this is interesting. Who did they fail to? Because to Johann, making anything out of porcelain is a success, right? If he failed in the king's eyes, then that's the king's perspective. And if you look at all the porcelain menagerie animals that still exist, like I said, there's cracks and fissures and holes, and they're look like Elmer's glue on the bottom. That for these porcelain makers who knew what they were asked to do was Herculean was a great success. But the king was never satisfied until it hit perfection. With Fatima's menagerie, part of it did succeed because she was able to save several animal lives. She was not able to see the fruition of her work because, once again, the king was not satisfied. So the answer to that question is really complicated. And that parallel is very intentional, basically, of showing us that our own choices and what we deem as success can definitely survive if we allow it to. But that's also the perspective of art is very suggestive. You know, like if I love a piece of art, you might hate it. And that's the same thing that both of these people faced. But with Fatima, that's a little more complicated because it wasn't just her life at stake. With the porcelain makers, it was just art. They could have failed and tried and failed again, but you can't do that with a living menagerie. So for me, the parallel between that it says that an autocratic environment cannot allow for art is both true and not true. State sanctioned art feels different from art from someone's soul. Um, Allowing something to survive and grow and thrive that doesn't have permission to unless it's done under a certain watch is also not something that we like to talk about or see. But I think both of these characters at the end understood that they had done all that they could. And in an environment like that, sometimes that's all you can do. Is that depressing? Yeah, it totally is. But Johann's art still exists today. So that modicum of success still exists.
We've got another question here in the chat. If anyone in the audience wants to post a question, go ahead. And you can even open your mics if you want to raise your hand, and you're welcome to ask your question to either Carolyn or Jillian yourself. And this one I don't totally understand. I didn't do the research for the novel. Jillian, maybe you'll understand a little bit better. Caroline asks, Jillian, did any of the politics and dynamics of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth affect your portrayal of Augustus?
Absolutely, it did. I don't really like writing about politics, to be honest with you. So, this book is mostly set in Dresden. If you pick up the biography about Augustus the Strong, written by Tim Blanning, that came out last October, which is really a fantastic biography, he goes really deep into the politics of what happened with this. Essentially, Augustus did not really ever even live in Poland, and Poland did not have a hereditary king. Augustus bribed and conned and drank his way to the top. And he was king of Poland by vote that he bribed people into. That was not something that I wanted to get into in this particular novel because it didn't have much to do with Johann and Fatima and Katerina. But the Polish politics in the 18th century are nothing like today's or like any other kingdoms in the 18th centuries. And it became so convoluted when I was trying to understand how could an elector of Saxony, which is basically like a prince, become king of Poland and keep both of those titles when they're not even really close to each other. It didn't make any sense to me. And when I found out that it was because he bribed everyone to get a vote, I thought, well, that makes sense for this terrible human. But I didn't want to really convolute that the entire book with the politics of Augustus. There needs to be another novel written, but the problem with that is that it's hard to write a novel when you're talking about human spirit when all of the things that he did were so icky to be able to have anybody root for him. I think that he would always be the antagonist. So the politics of Poland certainly played into this. And I don't think a lot of people knew that he was the second son, and his brother, who's supposed to be the Elector of Saxony, died when he caught smallpox from his mistress. We're just not we're just not a great family. Also, side note, his great-great-grandson was executed because he was Louis of the French Revolution. So the entire fam, did you not? Yeah, you all didn't know that. Yeah, this entire family line was doomed from the start with greed, ambition, and terrible decision making politically. So when I delved into the politics of what was the Polish kingdom at that point in time, I said, this is, I could add another 50,000 words based on the politics of that time. And I just chose to spare my own brain and step back from it. But if you want to read it, Tim Blanning, Augustus the Strong, and I believe that the rest of, actually, that's in the giveaway too. So not only can you win a mice and turtle, but let me get the book, you can also win. I love the title of this, Augustus the Strong, a study in artistic greatness and political fiasco. Perfect. Yeah. So that's the prize pack for pre-ordering, and I think most of you here today have done that. So yeah, that's that.
Thank you. Next, we have a question from Julie. She talks about a sense of place. Now, I know you went to Albrechtsberg after you wrote the novel, and I know you have photos too of going to England and seeing where Clara died. Um, she wants to know how did you create the sense of place? Do you have to visit to the place, or how are you able to really create that setting for the novel?
So, a lot of that I do from art that was based in the time period. You can go to a place today and it's entirely different than it was if you're writing historical fiction. And I think that's really important for all historical fiction writers to understand is that just because you went, to Wichita, Kansas, where I live today, doesn't mean that's what it was like in 1860. You do have to be careful with sense of place when you have not been there. So what I do is I actually look up YouTube videos of travelers around the world who go, and I reached out to Albrechtsberg early on in my research process and said, what's the oldest map you have of the porcelain factory so that I can accurately describe when they're turning corners or going up staircases or where the apartment was or what the basement was like. And they were able to get that to me, and I translated all of the German myself, and I was able to figure out where everything was located. When I got there, it felt like, when you've got that weird sense of deja vu, it's like, oh yeah, and then you turn the corner and this is what's next. But I also interviewed people who had been there, and I interviewed one porcelain artist. Her name is Trisha Zimick. You should definitely look up her work. She got to be a guest artist at Albrechtsberg and have her porcelain monkeys displayed there. And she told me the questions that I needed, which was how did it smell? What was the air quality like? When you breathe in, like what do your lungs feel like? Not only when you're in your kilns and in your own space, but when you were in Albrechtsberg, what was that like for you? And she said because it's so close to the river, everything smells like wet stone. And that was so important for me describing all of these places. So I interview a lot of people. I watch a lot of YouTube videos with GoPros, and then I make sure I always get an accurate historical map if I can.
It's such a big character in the book.
The castle itself.
Yeah.
I've always felt that Albrechtsberg was a character herself. Absolutely. And when I got there, it felt the exact same way.
Kayla asks if the monkey was real. That he was such a fun little character. I can't think of his name right now. Of course,
Amar.
yeah.
Yes, the monkey was real. Augustus had several monkeys on chains around his castle. Monkeys on chains were a fashion statement back in the 18th century. There were, I think, at least three or four that I saw record of. I don't know, and I can't prove if they were the same monkey, but a lot of mistresses had those in the 18th century. One very famous one was Du Barry. She had a monkey that she dragged around. But with Fatima's childhood in Budapest, I really assumed that she would have had something like that was close to her. So.
Carolyn, being an audiobook narrator yourself, I was curious to know if you've got some favorite narrators. Do you listen to audiobooks? Who do you like, and maybe who do you aspire to?
Yeah, I do. I do. I really like January Lavoie. I don't know if you've heard any of her work. I listened to a book about Martha Gellhorn and Ernest Hemingway that she narrated that was I really, really loved. And then I really like Elle Potter as well. She did Hamnet, I believe.
Mm.
So those are two voices that I love the sound of their voices and I love their work as well. And it's really fun. Listening to any audiobook is fun because there's little things to steal from other narrators, like, oh, that's how they do that. Oh, it's interesting, and I sort of I have to be careful not to start like taking on some of their tones and techniques when I'm narrating and also listening to a book, actually. Um, but yeah, no, those are two narrators who I highly recommend for sure.
What kind of organizations do you guys have for like audiobook narrators for getting together? I know there's the Audio Awards. Are there any other like annual conferences? How does that work?
Yeah, there's PANA, which is the Professional Audio Narrators Association. There's uh the APA, the Audio Publishers Association. They do a conference, the APAC, every year. That's for the publishers and the narrators, though. So that's a nice way to get together. But it's a tricky field in that we're all just working by ourselves. But I do think that makes people a lot more friendly than I would say than in theater, where I was for a long time, because you have to really want to reach out. And I also think because narrators are readers and readers are inherently empathetic. So those are good organizations to get together, and then lots of online groups as well.
Nice. I now that I'm doing more audiobooks, I talk about you with each other. Like I met with Scott Fleming the other day,
Oh, he
and
reached out. Yeah.
yeah, and I talk also about Ella Lynch, who does books for Ra Rachel, no, not Rachel, Elizabeth Anderson. So,
He
anyways,
just won an award last week.
Ah,
who
Ella
Ella
did.
did? Oh,
Yeah,
nice.
for a book that she narrated.
Oh, and actually, when I mentioned Ella, Scott was like, "Oh yeah, we're going together to some thing." So, like, I feel like I'm wiggling my way into your little community.
It's good. It's good. It's a nice community.
We have a couple more questions here. Uh, Karima asked, "Was the peacock based on a real bird?"
so all of the animals in the book are okay. All the porcelain animals had to have had some sort that are accurate anyway, because the lion and the panther that Samuel made look terrible because they didn't have the idea for the lion yet. So, all of the animals that are in the book, including the peacock, the monkey, the she-wolf, the foxes, all of those are based off of what would have been in the menagerie. So the peacock, yes. And in fact, Johann started out making a peacock without the expanded feathers, the tail. And then eventually he was brave enough to make a peacock with the feathery tail all extended. And that one is incredible. But He first did one just with the tail feathers out. And I think for me, I was looking at the proportions of that. The bodies are about the same, but he really shortened up the tail so it's not as elaborate as a real peacock would have been. But yes, and I actually learned a lot about peacocks when I was researching this because they're beautiful, but I didn't know they were predators. So I don't remember who it was, one of my beta readers was saying, your peacock just ate a mouse. And I said, yeah, apparently they're beautiful and dangerous, just like everything else in this book. So yeah, and think about this. A peacock is not native to Saxony, obviously, and there's no way they would have seen one in such detailed accuracy. So my assumption was every animal that was made from in the porcelain menagerie itself had to have existed in the menagerie proper for them to be able to know what it actually looked like.
Yeah, and that comes up as Johann has got to go to the menagerie and study these animals. Well, we're running up against the hour. I want to get to these last two questions, so I'm just going to kind of meld them together. So Karima asks about how the who brought the porcelain knowledge over to Dresden. Was that based on anything realistic, and especially that sunken ship? Was that based on historical fact? And I think that kind of ties into Ted's question about mixing historical context with the fictional story. How much do you have to put in service of the narrative, and how much is like, oh, yep, there was a Chinese boy who came to Dresden and helped give the knowledge? Like, how much is based on historical fact, and how do you decide?
So the boat that sank full of porcelain is real, and it is still at the bottom of the South China Sea, and they still recover pieces of porcelain from it to this day. Um, how is another one of those people who I assume was a real person? The reason that I say that is because Johann Candler had a repeating young man Chinese character in his art all the time. This is the same with Zubin in the Rhino Keeper. I found two paintings with a young boy that was a person of color that was close to Clara in two illustrations drawn from her. Shipwreck was real. King Augustus keeping slaves was real. And the knowledge of Chinese porcelain, that 72-step process, would not have been easy for them to obtain. There was a Portuguese missionary who found a lot of it by writing down a lot of the steps. But there's really, for me, there's no real explanation besides the two scientists who work on it, Botger and another person that didn't make it into the book, whose name is Schernhaus. Those two worked on it as hard as they could, but until they found the right vein of clay and the right formulations and the trial and error, they still didn't perfect it until something shifted. For me, Candler wouldn't have been able to see a young Chinese man anywhere. So how is partially based on reality and partially based on historical fact and partially based on this person in my imagination who definitely would have helped the cause for porcelain making and also would have created a terrible life for himself. Um, it's unfortunate that that's the way that art was back then when people were seen as less valuable than things. And I still think about that shipwreck all the time. I think it was something like 25 to 30,000 pieces of Chinese porcelain from the 18th century at the bottom of the sea. And of course, that would have been extremely, extremely desirable for any monarch to want. And knowing that it was free for the taking, you just got to figure out where the shipwreck is. You can't dive down that deep in the 1700s. So I also saw a question pop up about Hao's name, Hao. Hao is named after one of my very good friends who is from Taiwan. So
Well,
You
it
know, it
has,
means good.
oh, it means good.
How means good.
oh, I didn't
Yeah, you
know
know,
that. That's
like if
even
you're
better.
asking somebody, it's really funny because if you're asking somebody in Chinese, how are you? You say ni hao ma, which means are you good?
Oh,
And the answer is how, which means good, or bu hao, which means not so good. But that's that's the meaning of the word how.
that makes me even happier because I think, if he would have drowned in that shipwreck, he wouldn't have been good, but he
Yeah,
had parts of his life were good. Yeah,
yeah, he survived.
he sure did, against all odds. Oh, and Ted's question. How do you strike a balance? There's this adage that goes around through all historical fiction authors, and if you haven't heard this and you're a writer, you need it. History tells us what happened. Historical fiction helps us understand how it felt. And as someone who knew that strange and disastrous things, but also wonderful things happened in the creation of all of the art in the menagerie, both porcelain and real at this point in time. Chapter 30 with the fox tossing, the life of a young man who became apprentice and then a master sculptor. All of those strange weaving currents of both good and bad had to have felt really intense all the time. And so by taking those small things that I knew existed, there's only one portrait of the porcelain maker himself, and yet look at what he left behind. There's a shipwreck at the bottom of the sea. There's a castle on a hill with a porcelain kiln in the basement. All of those things for me wound together into this narrative that basically said, the things that we put our heart and soul into, which for Johann and Katerina both was family, survival, and legacy. That is just a story worth telling beyond the straight facts, which sadly enough was we don't really know what happened.
Well, I want to thank everyone so much for coming to this virtual celebration. If you still want to get your hands on the novel, a signed novel, go to Jillian's website, jillianforsberg.com, and you can order a signed copy there. And you'll be entered into a giveaway for all those special gifts that she's got. And then check her website for events she's doing. She's going to do events around the region, so you can see her in different places and meet her in person. Also, all three of us will be at the History Through Fiction conference in Massachusetts in March of 2026. You can learn about that at our website, historythroughfiction.com. If you're interested in going, we still have a few in-person spots, but the spots are limited. Carolyn, thank you so much. It was so fun to hear more about your process and to hear you do a live reading.
Thank you. It was really
And
wonderful to celebrate this book.
Jillian, congratulations. It's so wonderful to work with you. I'm so glad that we get to publish the Porcelain Menagerie.
Me too. It's been really fun. Yay.
All right, everyone, have an awesome day. Thanks so much for helping us celebrate